Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, I'm trying something a little different here where I'm going to do more of a close-up at the beginning as I'm introducing the video before we dive into it and go to our more traditional VTH format for reaction videos. So let me know what you think of that. I do want to give a shout out to George Brush from Illinois, who is an executive producer level patron. Thank you so much, George, for your support of the channel. Could not do this without you. Also want to let you know, if you are a patron or a member, I've put up a new poll for upcoming reaction to let you guys have a little bit of a say. I'm going to try to get back to doing that a little more often than I have been lately. So let me know what you think. Go ahead and vote right now. Patrons and members, let me know what the next reaction series should be. All right, with that in mind, we're going to be taking a look at a channel that is got a video here called Every U.S. Amendment Explained in 8 Minutes. And the channel is called The Paint Explainer. So I don't know how much of his other content is related to history, but this particular one is. And it's something we haven't really spent a lot of time talking about. Are the 27 amendments to the United States Constitution? What did they mean? What was the purpose for them? You know, many of these, there was a particular reason why they were passed when they were, and there have been a lot of failed amendments over the years, ones that did not get ratified. So before we get into this one, for those who might not be familiar with how our system of government works or how amending our Constitution works, I want to take just a minute or two and just explain the process for amending the U.S. Constitution. The United States Constitution was ratified in 1787. This is about 4 years after the official end to the American Revolution in 1783. So when the last British troops get pulled out, we're operating for several years by that point under something called the Articles of Confederation, which is a very loose central government idea that just kind of had these 13 states really just kind of loosely confederated with each other. I guess kind of think like the aftermath of the Soviet Union, where you had the Commonwealth of Independent States. It was this group of states who were former Soviet republics who were still loosely connected, but still also independent in a way. And so there was a move toward either fixing the Articles of Confederation or outright scrapping it for a new system. And there were a lot of people who wanted to just fix it, especially in the South, where people were about the idea of a strong state government and a weaker federal government, but they ended up coming to what some people thought was a convention to fix the Articles of Confederation. It actually turned out to be a constitutional convention chaired by George Washington to completely scrap it and come up with something new, which was a much stronger system. A lot of compromises go into making that happen, and among the agreements to get this ratified, it had to be ratified by a certain number of states to take effect, is that they promised to institute a Bill of Rights, which ends up being the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. So let's look real quick at exactly how an amendment gets passed, and then we'll start looking at these. So there's a couple of different ways this can happen. The most common way, and pretty much the way it has happened every time so far, is that 2/3 of both houses of Congress, so that means 2/3 of the members of the House of Representatives and 2/3 of the senators would be 67 to pass it, can pass an amendment. The president has no real role in this other than to be a cheerleader for or against it. But the president has no actual legal role in this. Then it goes to the states. But it can also happen by 2/3 of the states voting to call for an amendment by a convention called for that purpose. So then the amendment must be ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures. So you're like here in Ohio, I would not be voting on this. The people who I elected to the Ohio House, the state legislature, would have to vote on this. And 3/4 of our states would have to pass that. So that's a pretty high bar, or 3/4 of conventions called in each state for ratification. So that's why, for example, I say all the time when people say, well, we need to change the electoral college system, I say you're wasting your breath, because there's no way you would get a situation where you would get 3/4 of the states to agree to that. So it's really just kind of a non-starter. So you might have something that an overwhelming majority of people want to happen, but a majority is a lot easier to get than 3/4. So let's take a look at the amendments that have actually been passed, all 27 of them. And I should say up front before we dive into these that I'm just here to talk about the actual history of the amendments, not here to interpret them or give my opinion on them, because opinions vary. For example, the Second Amendment brings out very strong opinions on what it means to have the right to bear arms and what the clause in there about militia really means. And Supreme Courts have disagreed about that over time. 150 years ago, the First Amendment was interpreted very differently than it is today. The Supreme Court actually ruled in several cases that not only was it okay to teach the Bible in schools, but that it should be taught in schools, in public schools. Well, of course, 100 years later, very different opinion on what it means to have a separation of church and state, which, by the way, is not in the First Amendment. The concept of that description was used by Thomas Jefferson, but it does say Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of a religion or prohibiting the free practice thereof. Well, what does that mean? Well, that's up to the courts to decide what that means. So we're just going to talk about what it actually says, not how it's been interpreted.
First Amendment. It protects individuals' rights to express ideas, practice any religion or none, report news, gather in groups for peaceful purposes, and request government changes without fear of retaliation, ensuring a foundation for democracy and personal freedom. It basically guarantees freedom of speech, religion, press, assembly, and petition.
And this stuff might seem like no-brainers, but there are plenty of countries where, even with democracy, they don't necessarily have these things. And then there, of course, are still going to be limits on that. Free speech, the common one people always talk about, well, is, yes, you have free speech, but do you have the right to yell fire in a crowded theater where it can endanger people, right? So those are the kinds of things. You go to another country like, say the United Kingdom. There are limits on speech that exist in the UK that don't exist here in the United States. Do they still have free speech? Yeah, for the most part, I would say so, but it is more limited there than it is here.
Second Amendment protects the right to keep and bear arms, allowing individuals to own weapons for personal safety, defense, and recreational use. It supports the concept of self-defense and the collective security of a free state, reflecting historical importance placed on militias and individual right.
And so much of these first 10 amendments especially, you're going to see direct correlations between them and the events that led to the United States existing in the first place. So First Amendment, where they talk about Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of a religion. Well, remember that the United States was in many ways born out of people who left Great Britain and then later the United Kingdom over this idea of establishment of religion. You have a state religion in the UK, in the Church of England, and so people who didn't participate in that were still required to pay a tithe for a long time to the Church of England. And so they were trying to get away from that idea that there's a state-sponsored religion and that people have more freedom. So that was born out of that. The idea of militias, of course, is directly tied to how the American Revolution was born. In the first place, how did the Revolution start? In April of 1775, it was the British Army going out to seize weapons that had been gathered by state militias.
Third Amendment prevents the government from forcing citizens to house soldiers in their homes during peacetime without consent. This amendment addresses grievances from colonial times under British rule.
So again, some of these British colonies obviously did not exist at the time that the Third Amendment was passed. Again, this is something that was happening in particular like places like Boston, where they were being forced to quarter British soldiers against their will.
Emphasizing the importance of privacy and property rights in a free society.
Yep.
Fourth Amendment protects individuals from unreasonable searches and seizures, requiring law enforcement to obtain a warrant based on probable cause for such actions. It ensures privacy and security in personal property, reflecting a balance between individual rights and the needs of law enforcement.
So a couple of years ago, if you remember, I posted a video where I talked about being pulled over in Germany on the Autobahn and never was told why I was pulled over, was told to get out of my car, and my car was searched. And to a lot of Europeans, especially people like in Germany, that didn't seem like a big deal to them, but it was a big deal to me because here in the United States, they can't do that. You can't just be pulled over for no reason without probable cause, be told to get out of your car, have your car searched without even being asked for permission to search your car. All of that is protected by the Fourth Amendment. Now, we can argue about how that plays out legally here in the United States, but I've never had that happen in the United States because of the Fourth Amendment.
Fifth Amendment provides protections in legal processes, including protection against self-incrimination, guarantees due process of law, prohibits double punishment for the same charges, and ensures compensation for the taking of private property for public use.
So how does this differ than some countries, say, other democracies, where if new evidence comes to light in a case where you've already been found not guilty, like substantial evidence that really points to you being guilty, you can be tried again in some countries. Can't happen in the United States. If I'm found not guilty of murder in a court of law, I could walk out of that court and announce to the world that I did it. And in terms of criminal court, there's nothing anybody can do about it. Double jeopardy applies. I've been found not guilty of that crime. So the Fifth Amendment protects that. Fifth Amendment, you hear people assert their Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. I can't be forced to testify against myself in court. I can't be forced to testify at all if I am the one on trial. Now, people can interpret that if you're not willing to talk, but
it safeguards personal liberties and property rights in court. Sixth Amendment ensures the right to a fair and speedy trial, the right to know the charges, confront accusers, obtain witnesses in defense, and have legal representation. This amendment is fundamental to the justice system, guaranteeing a fair legal process for criminal defendants.
Such an important one because so much of our criminal justice system is built on the Sixth Amendment. These ideas of speedy trial, confronting your accusers, being told what you're charged with. The idea of habeas corpus is all connected really strongly to the Sixth Amendment.
Seventh Amendment guarantees the right to a jury trial in civil cases involving disputes over property or money, preserving the role of juries in the legal system. It reflects the historical importance of jury trials in protecting individual rights against arbitrary government action. Eighth Amendment prohibits excessive bail and fines, and cruel and unusual punishment, ensuring that penalties are fair and proportional to the offense. This amendment reflects society's values on humane treatment and justice, preventing the government from imposing overly harsh penalties.
So again, it's all about interpretation, right? 150 years ago, the idea of what was considered cruel and unusual punishment would be different than it is today. Some would argue that even the death penalty itself is in and of itself a violation of the Eighth Amendment. And it may well be that we get to the point at some point in our history where that will be decided to be true. We're not there yet. But there are constant fights about this, even the method of execution that is used or the severity of punishments for particular offenses. There's a lot of fighting that goes on over the Eighth Amendment over those issues.
Ninth Amendment states that the enumeration of specific rights in the Constitution does not mean that people do not have other rights that are not listed. This amendment protects unenumerated rights, acknowledging that individuals hold more freedoms than those explicitly mentioned. 10th Amendment.
And that's one of those ones that, in hindsight, you look back and you think, well, okay, that you really just kind of opened a can of worms there for people to argue for a lot of rights that maybe should be limited. So one of the brilliant things about the Constitution, and there's a movie called With Honor starring Joe Pesci. This is an absolutely phenomenal movie, and I highly recommend you check it out if you ever get the chance. But there's actually a question that is asked in Harvard in a class. What is the brilliance of the Constitution? And none of the students are getting at the best answer. And this homeless guy who happens to be in the room, and it's a long story, says the brilliance of the Constitution is that it can be changed, that the men who formed it knew that they didn't know everything and knew that generations later would have different issues to confront and different rights to deal with. And so they created a way for it to be changed. And that was one of the brilliances of it.
Clarifies that powers not delegated to the federal government by the Constitution, nor prohibited to the states, are reserved to the states or the people.
And this is one of the big debates that led to things like the American Civil War and has led to issues all the way along, this idea of states' rights. And where does the state get to pass a law that the federal government can't then step in and say, you can't do that? And so there have been issues over the years concerning things like segregation, slavery. How much power does the federal government have over the states when it comes to the issue of slavery? Things like legalizing marijuana, the speed limit. I remember a while ago there was a debate about states lowering the drinking age from 21 to be more like 18, where it is in a lot of other countries. And the federal government then, well, the federal government can't stop a state from changing the drinking age. What the federal government can then do is say, you know what? You can change it if you want, but we're not giving you any federal highway funds if you do it. And so it uses its power that way. And the 10th Amendment's at the core of a lot of those arguments.
Emphasizes the principle of federalism by limiting federal power and protecting state sovereignty and individual liberties. 11th Amendment limits the ability...
So now we're past the Bill of Rights, the original 10 amendments. And for the first 80 or so years of American history, there aren't a lot of new amendments that are passed. And then you get into, so the 11th and 12th are the only ones that get passed between the ratification of the Constitution and the American Civil War in 1865, when you have the 13th Amendment passed.
Of individuals to sue states in federal court, protecting states' sovereignty by requiring consent for such lawsuits. It addresses concerns over state immunity and the balance of power between state and federal governments. 12th Amendment modifies the procedure for electing the president and vice president, ensuring they are elected on separate ballots. This change was made to prevent confusion, promoting a clearer and more effective presidential election process.
So if you've ever seen the musical Hamilton, you know they talk all about the election of 1800, in which Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson end up tied in the Electoral College. It wasn't supposed to happen that way. The president and vice, basically what happened was whoever got the most electoral votes was president, and whoever got the second most was vice president. And it was understood that the voting would happen in such a way to make that clear. Well, somebody screwed up and Burr and Jefferson get tied, and it ends up going like through a long process before it's finally decided that Jefferson is president and Burr's vice president. And so it's after that they change that system, and we start to move toward the system we have today, where you have a running mate. So there's a line in there where Jefferson says, oh, we can change that because I'm the president now. Well, it's not that simple. The president had no power over it, but he used his influence to make sure that that got passed. That's the last amendment that you have for the next 60 plus years then.
13th Amendment abolishes slavery and involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime, marking a pivotal change in American society by formally ending the legal institution of slavery and reflecting the nation's commitment to individual freedom and human rights.
So a lot of people point out that it has that clause in there where it says that except when a crime has been committed and the person has been duly convicted in a court of law. So in other words, this allows for, like, say somebody was sentenced to a prison where they had to do hard labor. Involuntary labor is what it is in that case, and you can argue then that that's slavery, but that is protected under the law because the person had due process and they were convicted of a crime.
14th Amendment grants citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the U.S., guarantees equal protection under the law, and extends civil liberties.
So this was a direct refutation of the Dred Scott decision, which had happened just a decade or so before this, which ruled that black Americans did not have citizenship, did not have standing in court, did not have legal rights. This refutes that. This is in the aftermath. This is one of those 3 amendments passed in the aftermath of the American Civil War to not only end slavery, but then establish rights for what are called the freedmen. But the 14th Amendment is, again, one of those ones whose interpretation has changed over time. The very famous Roe versus Wade decision here in the United States that legalized abortion, that was recently overturned in the last couple of years, was based on the 14th Amendment and some of the clauses in there, like the Equal Protection Clause, which was originally passed with a very specific meaning, but like a lot of things in the Constitution, new situations that weren't thought of at the time get addressed, being seen through that same lens, and so interpretations change over time.
It played a crucial role in civil rights by defining citizenship and ensuring legal protections for all individuals, including former slaves. 15th Amendment prohibits denying the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude, advancing civil rights by ensuring that all men, regardless of race, have the right to vote.
All men, specifically, remember that. But yeah, this is, again, dealing with what's going on in the aftermath in the South. The South during Reconstruction is an ugly, ugly place. And in some ways, you could argue it's even uglier for for black Americans than it was during slavery, because when you were a slave to the Southern white kind of aristocracy and the Southern white people just in general, you had value. And I know that's a messed up way of describing it, but when you're not enslaved anymore, any value you had to some of those people is gone. And so now there's violence and there's murder and there's lynchings, because now what little property value that you had to those people is gone. And so now you're worthless. You're like nothing to them. And so the 15th Amendment was to protect their ability to vote. But again, how it was legal and what was practical and able to be protected depended entirely on the presence of federal troops in the South. And once those troops were pulled out at the end of Reconstruction, a lot of these rights under the 14th and 15th Amendment kind of go out the window, unfortunately.
Though actual implementation faced significant challenges.
Yeah.
Voting rights will be a key issue as we head into an election year. In November, a federal appeals court decision paved the way for a Supreme Court battle over the Voting Rights Act. Whether you saw this story may depend on which way you lean politically, because it is mostly being covered by left and center rates news sources. I know this thanks to Ground News, the sponsor of today's video. Ground News was founded by former NASA engineer Harleen Kaur to make it easier for readers to compare news coverage and think critically about the news they consume. They show you which sources are reporting on a story and where they fall on the political spectrum, so that you can make sure you're seeing the full picture. You can go to ground.news/TPE to check them out. The link is in the description. What I love about Ground News is how it bursts your bubble and lets you see different perspectives on the same topic.
We need that.
For example,
all of us way too easily get sucked into our own echo chambers and tend to surround ourselves with things that already confirm what we believe to be true and don't challenge that. And we need to have our ideas challenged.
Well, you can see that this article says that they're killing key remaining parts of the Voting Rights Act, while this other article focuses on predictions about what might happen in the Supreme Court. I'd highly encourage you to subscribe. Go to ground.news/TPE and you can sign up for less than $1 a month or get 40% off unlimited access to the Vantage subscription, which is what I use. Thanks again, Ground News, for sponsoring this video. 16th Amendment authorizes the federal government to collect income taxes without apportioning it among the states based on population, enabling a key source of revenue for the government and supporting the funding of public services and infrastructure.
So up until this point, the primary means of revenue for the federal government is on tariffs. And so it meant that places like the Port of New York and the tax collectors, the tariff collectors in New York, had insane amounts of power and influence on the federal government, because that's where the money was coming from. So there were income taxes, temporary ones. For example, during the American Civil War, there was a very high-end income tax on very wealthy income earners that was temporary. But this constitutional amendment makes it legal for the federal government to institute that, and we've had one ever since.
17th Amendment establishes the direct election of U.S. senators by the voters of the states, enhancing democratic governance by making senators more accountable to the electorate, reflecting a move towards greater democracy and public participation in government.
Of course, I don't think that was the intention of the founders, that it be more democratic. I think there was meant to be a difference between how the House was elected and how the Senate was elected. But yeah, at this point, for example, we talk all the time about the very famous Lincoln-Douglas debates for the Illinois Senate seat. And they were going around and they were debating in front of crowds of people who had no say in who won that election, because they weren't voting for that Senate seat. The legislature was voting for that Senate seat. So those people, they might have been able to use their influence on their representatives, their state representatives, but they had no direct say in how that was done.
18th Amendment initiates prohibition, making the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol illegal, aiming to improve social conditions, but ultimately leading to unintended consequences and the rise of illegal alcohol trade.
So notice it didn't ban the consumption of alcohol, just the manufacturer, the transportation, and the distribution of it. So if you drank it, it wasn't necessarily illegal, but the person who provided it to you could be in trouble. And yeah, we know the history of Prohibition. We've talked about this in other videos. Oversimplified has a video on Prohibition. We won't get into all of that.
Demonstrating the complexities of legislating morality. 19th
That said, complex, yes. And some people will even say you can't legislate morality, but really isn't all legislation a form of morality? We are deciding what we think is morally acceptable and what's not. When we say that murder is illegal, that is a moral question. I can't intentionally take the life of another person. That's legislating morality. It's just the degree to which we legislate morality and the basis of the moralities that we choose to legislate.
Amendment extends the right to vote to women, marking a significant milestone in the fight for gender equality by recognizing women's suffrage as a fundamental democratic right, reflecting the culmination of a long struggle for women's rights.
And this is happening in other places at about the same time. I think that women's right to vote in the United States happens almost at the exact same time as it happens in the UK. But notice that after a long period of very few amendments, now amendments are happening more regularly here in the early part of the 20th century. This is part of that progressive era where there's a lot of major changes happening in the United States.
20th Amendment changes the dates for the start of presidential, vice presidential, and congressional terms, and addresses presidential succession, aiming to reduce the period where there's an elected official whose successor has already been elected or will be soon, and ensures a smoother transition of power.
So, when the Constitution was passed, we had a vice president, but there was no clear concept of what happens when a president vacates the office. So, the first time you have this happen is when William Henry Harrison dies, the 9th president, a month into his term. He's the first president not to complete a term in office. And so John Tyler, his vice president, is he acting president? Does he have the full power of the president? What does that mean? There were a lot of questions about that. It was decided he basically just inherited the office and became fully the president, but it wasn't a clear-cut thing. It also wasn't clear-cut who succeeded if there was no president or vice president. So, for example, when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, and Andrew Johnson had also been a target there. If Johnson had been killed as well, it wouldn't have been Schuyler Colfax, the Speaker of the House, who would have become president. It would have been the President pro tem of the Senate, and that would have only been an acting president. I want to say it was Benjamin Wade at that time, senator from Ohio. I could be wrong about that, but I'm pretty sure that's who it was. But he would have only become acting president until a special election would have been called to fill the remaining term of that office. So this deals with a lot of those issues. It moves the inauguration of a new president from March, I think it's like March 4th, back to January 20th, where it is to this day.
21st Amendment revokes the 18th Amendment, ending prohibition and allowing states to regulate alcohol, acknowledging the failure of prohibition and the need for a more practical approach to alcohol regulation and consumption.
So we're into the 1930s now at this point.
22nd Amendment limits the presidency to 2 terms, responding to Franklin D. Roosevelt's 4-term presidency by establishing a formal restriction to prevent indefinite re-election and ensure periodic leadership renewal.
And specifically, you can still be president for as long as 10 years. If a vice president takes over, say like Theodore Roosevelt did, or Calvin Coolidge did in the 20th century. It depends on how long is left. If you have more than half of the term left over, more than 2 years, even if it's 2 years and a week, then that's considered a term for you. But if you have less than 2 years, you could still be elected to 2 full terms of yourself, your own. So you could be still president for as long as 10 years under the existing law.
23rd Amendment grants residents of Washington, D.C. the right to vote in presidential elections, addressing the lack of representation for the district's residents and moving towards greater democratic participation.
And the District of Columbia still does not have a voting representation in Congress. There's no senators. They have a delegate to Congress, but that delegate is a non-voting delegate, very similar to other U.S. territories.
24th Amendment prohibits poll taxes in federal elections, eliminating a barrier to voting for low-income individuals and advancing civil rights by ensuring that the right to vote cannot be conditioned on economic status. 25th Amendment clarifies presidential succession and procedures for addressing presidential disability, ensuring continuity and stability of the executive branch by providing clear guidelines for transferring power in cases of incapacity.
So this comes about for some very specific reasons. This creates a a system in which it will actually be used very soon after this, when up until this point, if the vice presidency was vacated because of a resignation or because of a death, there just was no vice president for the rest of that term. This creates a system where a new vice president can be nominated by the president and then approved by Congress, by the Senate. And that happens very soon after this is passed, when Gerald Ford becomes the new person under that system, and then he'll become president when the president resigns. So the 25th Amendment also creates a way in which to remove the president from office. So, for example, back when Woodrow Wilson was incapacitated because of a stroke, there would have been a system in place for a majority of the cabinet and the vice president to sign off and say, hey, the president is incapacitated, he can't fulfill the duties of the office, and then the vice president would be able to take over.
26th Amendment lowers the voting age from 21 to 18, recognizing the maturity and citizenship responsibilities of younger adults, particularly in light of military service, and expanding democratic participation.
Right, and this comes about in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, where you have a ton of 18, 19, and 20-year-olds being drafted, sent to the other side of the world and dying for their country, but not having the right to vote. And a lot of people had a problem with that. And so that was when this was done.
27th Amendment delays congressional pay changes from taking effect until after the next election, ensuring that legislators cannot immediately benefit from their own decisions regarding salary adjustments.
And it gives the voters a chance to say, hey, you gave yourself a raise, you're out in the next election.
Promoting accountability and fairness. Shout out to these guys who are...
So that's where we're at. And so in my lifetime, we've had one amendment passed, the 27th Amendment. That's been the only one in my lifetime. So it doesn't happen very often, and especially in today's polarized society, it would be very, very difficult to get something that would get the support. You would have to have the support of both parties, and you would have to have the support of liberal states and conservative states and moderate states to get something like that passed. So it's very unlikely unless something really, really, really super important that everybody gets behind happens. So let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below, and we'll see you again soon with another video. Thanks for watching.